18 seconds. One African soldier. And a U.S. president who didn't expect to be silenced. At a remote military base in West Africa, Donald Trump humiliated Ibrahim Traoré in front of cameras and flags. But just 18 seconds later, Traoré looked him in the eye and dropped 6 quiet words that made even U.S. generals hold their breath. What did he say, and why did that single sentence echo across the African continent and rattle the halls of Washington, Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso? 2:17 p.m. The air stank of burnt tires and anger. A blistering sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked streets of the capital, but no one felt the heat anymore. They were too busy running or fighting. Whistles of rubber bullets sliced through the air, followed by sharp cracks and clouds of tear gas, billowing like ghosts rising from the earth. The city was erupting. A teenage boy with stormy eyes and a heart pounding like war drums darted between abandoned fruit stalls, his lungs burning from smoke and adrenaline. His name was Ibrahim Traoré, and at 17 he had already thrown more stones than dreams. All around him, chaos bloomed like wildfire. Protesters screamed in Doulamore, and French voices weaving together in a single cry, "Down with corruption, out with the occupiers." Smoke curled above a flaming police truck while boots thundered behind him. Boots that didn't belong to his people? He ducked low behind a tipped-over vendor cart. Just seconds ago, he had hurled a jagged cobblestone straight at a riot shield. He didn't know if it hit its mark, but he'd seen the white flash of an American-made baton swing toward his friend in retaliation. That friend hadn't gotten back up. A sharp whistle pierced the air again. "Il est là, he's here," one of the soldiers shouted. Ibrahim's breath caught. He wasn't facing ordinary local police this time. These were special units, heavily armed, disciplined, and trained under a foreign flag. Their uniforms bore the insignia of the National Guard, but their tactics were different. Precise. Brutal. And on their sleeves, stamped in black and gray, was a patch he would never forget. U.S.-funded security training program. AFRICOM. The chase was on. He bolted left, shoving through a back alley littered with broken glass. His worn sandals slapped the ground like gunshots, and his shoulder burned where a rubber bullet had grazed him earlier. Pain made him stumble, and that's when he heard the sound. Footsteps, getting closer. He turned a corner and found himself trapped in a narrow corridor between 2 crumbling buildings. The wall was too high to climb. A dead end. Panic rose in his throat. His heart pounded. He had seconds. Then, like a whisper in a storm, a voice called out, "Par ici, over here." He spun toward a half-collapsed wooden door where a pair of wide brown eyes peeked through a crack. A boy no more than 10 gestured frantically. Ibrahim didn't think just dove inside. The child closed the door, shoved a crate in front of it, then motioned for silence. They crouched in the shadows, breathing in unison. Outside, boots scraped past the door, then stopped. Silence. Ibrahim held his breath. A cough, a muttered curse. Then the boots moved on. After what felt like an hour, though it was barely a minute, the boy spoke barely above a whisper. "They say you're the one who speaks on the radio sometimes, the student who doesn't fear them." Ibrahim said nothing. He just nodded. The boy nodded back with something like reverence. He felt a sudden pull, not of fate, but of responsibility. He wasn't just another angry face in the crowd anymore. A distant explosion shook the walls. Both flinched. Ibrahim stood slowly, gripping his side where blood had soaked through his shirt. He pulled the door open and stepped into the light again. The sun was beginning to lower now, casting long shadows over the battlefield that was once a market square. Smoke curled lazily through the air, like the exhale of a monster satisfied with its damage. Across the street, a cluster of armored men moved in formation, rifles slung low visors down. As one turned to speak to another, Ibrahim saw it clearly. The patch, the symbol, the silent admission that these men were not here to protect them, but to enforce the will of others. U.S. funded. He stared at it, memorizing every thread. That was the moment something hardened inside him. Not just anger, a vow. If they could import soldiers, he would become something they couldn't export: resistance itself. And just like that, Ibrahim Traoré disappeared into the alleys once more, not as a boy with a stone, but as a spark that would one day set empires trembling. The scent of smoke still lingered in Ibrahim's hair, As he stepped into the low mud brick house, its walls cool against the late afternoon heat, dust clung to every crevice of the floors, the furniture, their clothes, like the memory of a wound that refused to heal. His mother didn't say a word when she saw the blood on his shirt. She simply reached for a bowl of water and began wiping his side, her fingers trembling only slightly. He winced. She noticed but didn't stop. "Is it worth it?" she asked, her voice flat. He didn't answer. Not yet. Her hands slowed. She looked at him, really looked at him, the boy she had raised to be quiet, to listen, to avoid fire even when everything around them burned. But that boy was slipping away, and she knew why. The house, like many others in the district of Tongan, sat on land that didn't belong to them anymore. Not technically, not legally. It had been his father's, passed down from his grandfather, who had planted mango trees with bare hands and kept goats in a field that now held satellite towers and armed patrol vehicles. It happened 3 years ago, a knock on the door, a document with unfamiliar seals, and two foreign men in gray suits who didn't speak French well, but knew exactly how to threaten. The land was being repurposed for development, they said. A mining logistics hub. Something strategic. A week later, soldiers showed up with bulldozers and American accents. His father stood in the yard with his machete eyes wild with disbelief. He was never violent, but he stood his ground. They beat him anyway. Ibrahim, 14 at the time, had watched it all from the corner of the wall, clutching a dull kitchen knife as if it could cut through anything more than his fear. They never even looked at him, just walked past like he was nothing. His father never spoke of that day again. He drank more, smiled less. When he died a year later from a stroke, some whispered it wasn't the blood clot that killed him, it was humiliation. That was the first seed, but the second was planted deeper. That night after his father was taken to the hospital, his mother sat with him under the tree in their backyard, the only tree the bulldozers hadn't touched, and told him a story he had never heard before. Not in school, not from neighbors, only whispered among the oldest. She told him of Kawamba, his great-great-grandfather, who once led a dozen barefoot men with spears against French cavalry during the War of Resistance in 1915. Of how he was captured, beaten, and executed in public, yet never bowed. Of how his last words were a curse, not against the enemy, but against silence. "If my blood waters this ground, let it grow rebels, not crops." Ibrahim hadn't spoken for a full hour after hearing it. From that night on, something shifted. He began walking past the old colonial walls with slower steps, longer gazes. He started collecting pamphlets, old speeches, by Sankara books, with dog-eared pages and words the teachers told them not to read. At night, he would lie in bed, the fan turning uselessly overhead, and listen. Listen to the sound of foreign helicopters thundering over their roof, slicing through the African night like unwelcome steel vultures. Sometimes he counted them. Sometimes he cursed them. But mostly he just listened to the quiet rage that filled the spaces in between. Their house was no longer a home. It was an island surrounded by occupation, by barbed wire, by secrets. The neighbors whispered of men who disappeared after speaking out, of daughters harassed by soldiers on routine patrols, of funerals without bodies. But they said nothing aloud, not anymore. Because silence, they believed, kept you alive. But Ibrahim was beginning to believe the opposite. That silence was a kind of slow death, not of the body, but of the soul. And he wasn't ready to die quietly. He didn't tell his mother this. He didn't need to. She saw it in his eyes, the fire behind the bruises. And though she feared it, she did not try to put it out. Outside, the helicopters came again, roaring low across the rooftops. This time he didn't flinch. He just stared at the ceiling, whispering the name Kawamba over and over again, like a quiet declaration of war. Washington, D.C., the Pentagon briefing room. The flags behind the podium stood in calculated symmetry, bold reds, deep blue stars, embroidered with the kind of precision only reserved for war. At the center stood President Donald J. Trump. Chin-high lips, pursed his voice, cutting through the room with familiar confidence. "We are launching a strategic military initiative to protect freedom, stability, and American interests abroad," he announced, pausing as the camera zoomed in. "Operation Shieldlight will expand our presence in critical regions, including West Africa, where terrorist threats, Chinese expansionism, and unchecked instability jeopardize both local and U.S. security. We will not abandon our allies. We will fortify them. With strength. The words were met with applause from the generals flanking him, medals glinting under the artificial lights, hands folded with theatrical dignity. A digital map of Africa flickered onto the screen behind him. Circles, arrows, and flashing dots spread across the Sahel like a battle plan drawn by distant hands. Burkina Faso was just another light on that screen, a dot labeled Forward Ops Base 17. Miles away in a cramped courtyard shaded by rusted sheet metal, the same broadcast played on a battered TV screen perched atop a stack of cinder blocks. The colors were faded. The image glitched every few seconds, but the message came through perfectly. Ibrahim sat on a low bench with 4 friends, university dropouts, mechanics, and poets in waiting. Their faces were a study in silence, not out of confusion, but disgust. "Protect freedom," one of them muttered. Who's another laughed bitterly. "Ours, apparently. That's why they shoot at us when we march." No one responded. Ibrahim leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring hard at the glowing screen. His jaw tightened with every word. Every mention of stability control and cooperation felt like an insult, like salt pressed into an open wound. He wasn't surprised, but he was no longer numb. The news anchor cut in translating Trump's speech into French with a tone of forced diplomacy, trying to soften edges too sharp to hide. Words like partenariat and security renforcé slid off her tongue like oil over gravel. Ibrahim didn't need a translation. He understood perfectly. There were no words in Trump's speech about poverty, hunger, or dignity, no acknowledgement of history, no understanding of what it meant to lose landblood or fatherhood to so-called partnerships. Just lines, just maps, just lights. Ibrahim stood slowly, dusting his hands against his pants. "He talks like we are ants on his map," he said, his voice low but clear, steady as stone. The others looked at him. In that moment, something shifted again. Not a riot, not a rebellion, something quieter, a promise. The day Ibrahim signed the enlistment form, his mother did not speak to him for 12 hours. Not a word, not a look, not even the softest breath of approval or resistance. She simply turned her face toward the clay wall of their home and stirred her millet stew in silence, the wooden spoon hitting the pot like a slow drumbeat of disapproval. His uncle, a retired school teacher who'd once been imprisoned for printing banned pamphlets, stared at the paper in disbelief. "You," he asked, blinking behind thick glasses. "The boy who spits at their jeeps, the one who memorized Sankra's speeches like prayer." Ibrahim folded the form, slid it into a plastic sleeve, and stood. "To know your enemy," he said quietly, "you wear his armor." There was no ceremony, no goodbye party, just a backpack, a long stare from his younger cousin, and the creak of the door as he stepped into the morning sun. Dust swirled around his feet like a whisper of warning. Basic training was held just outside the capital in a walled compound, once used by the French, now retrofitted with American funding and methods. The gates were metal, the walls were scarred, and the drills were relentless. He had expected pain, but he hadn't expected the coldness. Every hour was regimented 5 a.m. drills, weapons cleaning, tactical simulation, perimeter patrols, classroom instruction, and counterinsurgency. The Burkinabe officers barked orders with inherited brutality, but it was the Americans who truly unsettled him. They didn't shout. They watched. Always. From towers, doorways, the corners of training fields. Calm, still. Not angry, analytical. They spoke in short bursts of English peppered with acronyms and half-smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Watch that one," he once heard one of them mutter. "The tall one with the stare." They meant Ibrahim. He learned quickly, faster than most of the other recruits. Not because he wanted to excel, but because he needed to understand how they thought, how they moved, how they dehumanized a target and called it discipline, how they spoke about villages as zones and civilians as variables. At night, he wrote everything down in a small leather-bound notebook he hid under a loose floorboard, not just tactics, but questions. How do they justify occupation? How do they sleep? What makes a man abandon his own flag for another's paycheck? The barracks were Spartan cots in rows, the smell of sweat and gun oil thick in the air. One night, as he was cleaning his boots, a fellow recruit from the northern provinces leaned over. "Why are you really here?" he whispered. Ibrahim didn't look up. I want to serve my country, the boy scoffed. So why do you watch the instructors more than you listen? Ibrahim didn't answer. He just kept polishing. That night, the rhythmic hum of American Blackhawks passed overhead, their shadows sweeping across the training yard like mechanical vultures. From his bunk, Ibrahim stared at the ceiling, counting each beat of rotor blades. 1, 2, 3. He wondered which village they were flying over now, which patch of his homeland would be mapped, marked, or monitored. And as exhaustion pulled him under, he whispered to himself, I am not becoming one of them. I am becoming ready. The next morning during firearms training, he outshot everyone. Not by much, but enough to be noticed. A visiting American captain stopped him on his way back to barracks. You've got good instincts, he said. Ibrahim shrugged. You teach well, sir. The captain smiled. Keep this up, you'll go far. He meant it as a compliment. But to Ibrahim, it sounded like a warning. By the third month of training, Ibrahim had learned to move like a soldier, speak like a soldier, even sleep like one light alert, one eye always open. But when the lights went out and the snoring began to fill the barracks, his mind woke up. That was when the real work began. He kept his contraband wrapped in old cleaning rags hidden behind a loose ceiling panel above his bunk. Revolution through the eyes of Sankara. The autobiography of Malcolm X and a half-burnt collection of banned pamphlets passed down from older radicals. Paper in the camp was precious. Words were weapons. Each night, by the pale beam of a flashlight tucked under his blanket, he read slowly, deliberately. Sankara's words felt like ancestral thunder. A soldier without political education is a potential criminal. And Malcolm X's story struck him like a mirror, cracked in two, a boy born into poverty, stripped of power, only to return through knowledge and will. He underlined passages in pencil, jotting notes in the margins, like whispered prayers. Some nights he didn't sleep at all. He would stare up at the ceiling, thinking about what it meant to wear the same boots as the men who had humiliated his father. But instead of guilt, he felt strategy. Each day in uniform was a lesson, each order another piece of the system he had vowed to dismantle from within. Soon he wasn't alone. It started with a whisper during weapons maintenance, a quiet reference to Sankara that only a real believer would catch. Then a glance exchanged during drills, and eventually an invitation after lights out muttered with careful neutrality, come sit with us by the latrines after inspection. There in the shadows beyond the floodlights, a half circle of recruits began gathering twice a week. They brought no books. They quoted from memory. One recited quotes from Frantz Fanon, another shared stories of Algerian resistance. Ibrahim didn't lead, not officially, but they all listened when he spoke. We were not born into chains, he said, one night, voice low and steady, but we were taught to carry them like tradition. The group nodded. One of them, Asaka, a wiry recruit from the East, was especially vocal. He questioned everything, why the Americans trained them to shoot before they learned the names of their own provinces, why the maps in the briefing rooms only labeled cities of tactical value, why poverty was called instability when it was policy. But Asaka was careless. He spoke too loudly during a lunch break, mocking the phrase strategic cooperation, while an instructor passed by. The next morning his bunk was empty. No warning, no goodbyes, just silence and the faint smell of bleach where his cot had been. By noon the barracks buzzed with tension. What happened to Isaka, someone whispered. Transferred, said another. North Post, volunteer. But no one believed that. Ibrahim said nothing for hours. But that night after roll call, he stood in front of the half circle by the latrines and looked each one of them in the eye. We speak, he said quietly, but we do not shout. We share, but we do not spread, until the time is right. One of the younger recruits asked, and who decides the time? Ibrahim didn't smile. History does, but we help it move. The weeks that followed were colder. The group shrank. Some avoided Ibrahim altogether, afraid to be seen too close. The Americans watched him more now, their eyes lingering longer, their questions slightly more pointed during drills. But still he kept reading. Still the notes grew thicker. He was no longer just learning how to resist. He was learning how to build mind cells language. Not just opposition, but alternative. An idea that could survive even if he didn't. And as he turned each page in the dark, the thought returned again and again. They teach us how to march in formation, but they never taught us how to think. That is our battlefield. They called it Zone 9, but to the locals it was Kutugu's black earth, a swath of farmland rich in rare earth minerals where the soil turned dark and sticky after the rains clinging to your boots like memory. Now it was being stripped section by section by a Chinese-American consortium under military protection. The orders came down fast. A group of villagers had blockaded access to the main road, armed with little more than machetes, cooking pots, and their own fury. The recruits were loaded onto trucks before dawn. No briefing. Just rifles, riot gear, and a thick tension that tasted like blood on the tongue. Ibrahim sat in the back of the transport vehicle, silent, cradling his weapon like a question he hadn't yet answered. When they arrived, the scene was surreal, not hostile, but heartbreakingly human. Dozens of villagers stood their ground in front of bulldozers, shouting, crying, some clutching babies, others banging tin cans together in defiance. Elders held up faded deeds of land ownership, flapping in the wind like forgotten promises. Children wept behind them, confused but unafraid. A lieutenant shouted through a megaphone, demanding dispersion. Nothing moved. A signal was given. The recruits raised their rifles. Ibrahim's heartbeat thundered in his ears. His finger hovered over the trigger. He looked into the eyes of a woman no older than his mother, clutching a photo of her husband, the very land surveyor who'd once worked with his father. She didn't look angry. She looked betrayed. He lowered his rifle. The world around him seemed to pause like breath held underwater. "Raise your weapon, soldier," someone screamed behind him. He didn't move. The first baton cracked across his back like a lightning strike, then another harder to the ribs. He fell to the ground, choking on dust, fists still clenched around the cold metal of his unused weapon. Boots descended on him, kicks to his stomach, to his legs, to his face. Somewhere in the blur of pain and dust, he heard his name called out, not in anger, but in disbelief. Ibrahim Traoré. The beating stopped. Through swollen eyes, he saw a man step forward from the command unit, older mustached eyes hard but suddenly filled with recognition. Major Konate, a name he hadn't heard in years. "You're Abdoulaye Traoré's boy," the officer said. Ibrahim didn't answer. Konate turned to the soldiers. "Stand down." Confusion rippled through the ranks, but they obeyed. The riot dissolved in strange silence. Villagers still stood untouched. The bulldozers didn't move. Later that night in the infirmary, Konate sat beside Ibrahim without speaking for several minutes. "Then finally your father once taught me how to hold a compass. Said a man's values should work the same." Ibrahim said nothing, but in his silence there was strength. He had disobeyed. He had nearly died for it. And yet he had not lost, not this time. It started with a rumor, as revolutions often do. A whisper in the barracks. A scribbled note passed in the mess hall. A strange shift in troop assignments. And then at 3:42 a.m., a blackout. For 8 full minutes, Ouagadougou stood in complete darkness. No streetlights, no radio, no orders. Then came the gunfire. Bursts crackled through the city's south sector, where the Presidential Guard was stationed. Explosions lit up the horizon in stuttering flashes, not a full assault, but a desperate, half-coordinated attempt at something bold. Something broken. A group of junior officers, mostly from the northern regiments, had launched a coup, or so it was called by dawn. By sunrise, it was over. Their armored trucks had been blocked 2 blocks from the presidential palace. A few defecting soldiers were dead, others captured. The rest vanished into the back streets and bush, some fleeing toward Ghana's border, others into myth. The government moved swiftly. Within hours, checkpoints doubled. Phone lines were tapped. Names were named. And Ibrahim Traoré found his on the list. He wasn't surprised. Only the speed of it caught him off guard. He'd been too visible, too articulate. He hadn't fired a shot, hadn't made contact with the coup plotters, hadn't even known it was coming. But in times of panic, the regime needed scapegoats, and he had made himself known. They came for him at night, 4 officers in plain uniforms, no insignias, no paperwork. He opened the door before they knocked. He didn't run. That would have made things easier for them. They took him without a word, stuffing him into a back seat between 2 soldiers who smelled of sweat and silence. He asked nothing, said nothing. The room they brought him to was cold and windowless, lit by a single flickering bulb that buzzed with every lie it was meant to illuminate. They stripped him of his shirt, his boots, even his dog tags. Just a number now. The first question came casually. "Who else was with you?" He blinked. A fist drove into his ribs. Names. He coughed, tasting blood. Again, names. But he had none to give. The next hours blurred into something inhuman. Stripped to the waist, wrists bound to a rusted metal chair, the back of his head slammed against concrete more times than he could count. Every accusation came with another blow. Every denial was met with ridicule, sometimes laughter, sometimes worse. They played games. A cloth soaked in cold water over his face. A plastic bag tightened, loosened, tightened again. Electric shocks on his calves, not to disable, just to humiliate. Between sessions, he was left alone in silence, shirtless, freezing ribs, burning heartbeat steady. He refused to scream. That was all he could control. Once a masked interrogator leaned in and whispered, "You read Sankara, right?" Even he broke. Ibrahim looked him in the eye. "No, he was betrayed. There's a difference." The man laughed. "You'll learn the difference too, eventually." By the second night, he could barely sit upright, one eye swollen shut, breath shallow, still no confession, no plea, just silence. And then, like a crack in the routine, something changed. The door opened, a familiar voice cut through the haze. "Unbind him." The soldiers hesitated. "I said unbind him." Now. It was Major Konate, the same man who had stopped the assault in Kudugu, the man who had once knelt beside his broken body and uttered his father's name like a buried prayer. His face was harder now, lips pressed tight, eyes unreadable. Konate stepped forward, dismissing the others with a glance. For a moment, it was just the two of them, Ibrahim barely conscious, Konate pacing like a man caught between loyalty and duty. "I told them you weren't part of it," he said, voice low. "I vouched for you." Ibrahim's lips cracked into a painful grin. "And they still let them try to break me." Konate didn't answer. He crouched, handed him a cloth soaked in water, and said quietly, "You've made too many enemies, Traoré. Too fast. Too loud. You should disappear for a while." Ibrahim nodded, eyes burning, not from pain, but clarity. He had just been baptized by the system, and now he knew what needed to be done. The escape wasn't cinematic. No explosions, no rooftop leaps, no dramatic car chases. Just a door left unlocked longer than usual, a guard distracted by a text message, and a utility corridor that led to a back service entrance forgotten by most, except for one man who remembered. Major Konate again. He didn't say goodbye, didn't offer a hand or a word of hope. He simply left a folded map beneath a bundled blanket in Ibrahim's holding cell, marked with one red X and a note, "You have 3 hours before they realize." Ibrahim limped through the dark like a ghost. Each step burned. Each corner was a risk. But by the time dawn broke over Ouagadougou, the boy they'd tried to break had vanished into the city's underbelly. He was officially listed as missing during transfer. No photos, no funerals, no searches. The story was swallowed by bureaucracy, just another glitch in the regime's perfect order. For the next 8 months, Ibrahim Traoré became a whisper. He moved from safe house to safe house, old bookstores, shuttered mechanics shops, goat farms guarded by women with sharper instincts than any soldier. He shaved his head, changed his gait, sometimes even faked a limp. But what he didn't do, not once, was stop organizing. It started small. One by one, he reconnected with the others. The ones from the latrine meetings, the book circle, the late-night quote swappers. Some thought he was dead. Others feared he'd been turned. But when they saw him bruise, thinner eyes sharper than before, they knew he was more alive than ever. They began calling themselves the People's Flame. It wasn't a formal group. No headquarters, no uniforms, just a network cells in towns and villages, in schools, in bakeries, in transit trucks. Information moved through coded phrases. Posters appeared overnight with anonymous quotes. "Your silence feeds your chains." QR codes led to encrypted audio speeches. USB drives swapped like contraband at fish markets. Ibrahim didn't give orders. He gave purpose. He taught them how to think, how to ask questions that made the walls around them tremble. Not just, why is there poverty, but who profits from our hunger? Not why is there a base, but who is it really protecting? But as the movement quietly spread like wildfire, so, too, did the storm gathering on the horizon. Late one night, Ibrahim sat in the back room of a tailoring shop in Bobo Dioulasso, listening to a cracked radio broadcast smuggled through a shortwave frequency. The station was French, the Voice American, announcing the expansion of U.S. strategic operations in West Africa with the addition of 2 new military installations, one of which is expected to be located in central Burkina Faso. President Donald Trump stated earlier this evening that these bases are critical to the fight against terrorism and the protection of regional assets. He didn't move, just sat there, listening. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of sewing machines next door. Outside, the night air pressed in heavy through a slit in the window full of dust and tension. 2 new bases? The message was clear. They weren't just expanding, they were planting roots. He reached into the inner pocket of his shirt and pulled out a weathered photograph, his father in front of the mango trees that once stood behind their old house, smiling with a farmer's pride and a revolutionary's patience. Ibrahim clenched the photo tightly in one hand, the radio crackling behind him with the tail end of the broadcast. The word stability echoed through the static, cold and meaningless. He whispered as if to himself, but loud enough for the man beside him to hear. They don't build bases to protect. They build them to stay. The man nodded. Then we light the flame higher. The plan was reckless, dangerous, borderline impossible. But in revolutions, sometimes the most reckless ideas are the only ones that work. The national radio station in Ouagadougou sat at the edge of the city center, 3 stories of faded concrete and thick metal gates guarded not by soldiers, but by bureaucracy and complacency. It wasn't a military fortress. It didn't need to be. In the regime's eyes, words were no longer dangerous. Guns were. They had forgotten how much damage a voice could do. At 2:03 a.m., a delivery truck stolen, repainted, and carrying 3 crates of outdated electronics rolled to a quiet stop behind the building. From its rear, 5 men and 1 woman emerged. None wore uniforms. Only one carried a pistol. The others carried USB drives, timing charts, frequency interceptors, and an old broadcast technician who still remembered which circuit breaker turned off the emergency signal. By 2:11 a.m., the station's backup generator had been overridden. The security guard on duty was locked inside the bathroom, unharmed but deeply confused. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the national radio feed cut to static. 10 seconds later, a voice filled the airwaves, calm, deep, and unmistakable. "My name," it began, "does not matter as much as the truth I bring. But for those still wondering, yes, it's me." In every village, in every town where the night was still and radios hummed low beside sleeping families, people sat up straight. I speak to those who know the price of silence, to those whose fathers were buried with unpaid land deeds, to mothers who watched foreign boots crush the soil their children were born on, to soldiers told to shoot before they could question. In the studio, Ibrahim stood behind the microphone, sweat dripping down his temple, voice unwavering. There are those who believe Burkina Faso is a tool, a chess piece, a blank spot on their map. They draw borders with ink that smells like oil. They pave runways where millet once grew. They fund soldiers not to protect you, but to protect what they take from you. He paused. Across the country, people leaned closer. You are not weak. You are not small. You are not for sale. And then the final words, simple, sharp, eternal. If they own our land, we own our soul. He clicked the mic off. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the breath before thunder. By morning, the message had spread faster than the regime could contain it. Audio clips passed through Bluetooth transfers, WhatsApp threads, grainy screen recordings. In markets and mosques, in schools and side streets, people repeated his words like scripture. And slowly, defiantly, they began to walk toward city squares, toward government buildings, toward something bigger than protest. Not for Ibrahim, for themselves. The fall didn't happen in a roar. It happened in a staggered, uncertain silence. After Ibrahim's voice cracked the airwaves, something unexplainable stirred across Burkina Faso. It was not just a protest. It was not just anger. It was memory awakened, burning, ancestral. In cities and villages alike, people began to move. They flooded the streets in sandals and bare feet with no weapons but their numbers, no leaders but each other. From Kaya to Bonfora, they marched, not shouting slogans, whispering truths, repeating his words. If they own our land, we own our soul. By the 3rd day, government buildings were locked down. By the 5th, the presidential convoy was nowhere to be found. Rumors swirled the president had fled the country. The vice president had been placed under house arrest. Parliament had not convened. The army had declared neutrality. No shots fired, no tanks rolled. Just absence. Like the system had collapsed under the weight of its own rot. And into that void, all eyes turned to one name: Ibrahim Traoré. He had not asked for this. He was still in hiding, still changing safe houses every few nights. But now those houses had become sanctuaries. Old women brought him bread and honey without asking. Children left notes at doorsteps addressed simply to the one who speaks. By the end of the second week, local militias, disorganized, unaffiliated, but fiercely loyal to the people, began setting up citizen checkpoints. Several units of the military refused orders from the old chain of command. The flame was no longer underground. It was everywhere. Then came the delegation. 10 men in mismatched uniforms and 3 elders wrapped in white cotton robes appeared at the gates of a sugar warehouse where Ibrahim was being sheltered. No weapons, no guards. Just gravity in their eyes. "You must lead," the eldest said, "even if only to stop chaos from devouring what we've won." Ibrahim shook his head. "I am not a president," he said. "I am barely a survivor." They came again 2 days later, this time with 5,000 signatures on folded paper sheets, traders, farmers, teachers, even junior soldiers. They stood outside for 5 hours in silence, waiting. He still refused. "I am not here to be a symbol," he told them. "I am here to burn the symbols down." But they did not leave. And then on the 7th day, a boy no older than 10 approached him as he stepped outside to breathe. He was barefoot, missing a front tooth, and holding a torn photo of Ibrahim clipped from a smuggled newspaper. The boy asked, "If you don't lead, who will protect my mother?" Ibrahim said nothing. That night he sat alone beneath the stars on the roof of a half-demolished schoolhouse, legs dangling over the edged knees raw from prayer. He thought of Kawamba, his great-great-grandfather, who had once stood against French bayonets with nothing but a spear and a refusal to kneel. He thought of his father, crushed not by war but by quiet conquest. He thought of Isaka, of Konate, of every word he had spoken that somehow refused to die. He whispered a single sentence into the wind. "I did not ask for the fire, but I carry the flame." And the next morning when the elders returned, he did not speak. He simply nodded. By noon, the airwaves buzzed with an unofficial declaration: Burkina Faso had a transitional leader. Not elected, not installed. Chosen. Pulled from the streets and into history. Some outside the country called it chaos. Others called it a coup. But to those who marched barefoot under the red sun, with blistered hands and steady hearts, it was something else entirely. They called it beginning. The world watched, and the world recoiled. Within 72 hours of Ibrahim's rise as transitional leader, the headlines began stacking like dominoes, not from within Burkina Faso, but from London, Paris, New York, from glass towers where peace was theorized but rarely practiced. Rebel commander declares himself leader. The Guardian. Burkina's government falls to military populism. Le Monde instability in Sahel coup or awakening. Al Jazeera. African nation slips into anarchy amid regime collapse. CNN, the language was predictable, non-democratic, unconstitutional threat to regional stability. The United Nations called for an immediate restoration of electoral order. The European Union paused humanitarian funds. NATO issued a statement of grave concern. But it was Washington's reaction that landed like a hammer. President Donald Trump, now in his second term and increasingly focused on reestablishing American military leverage abroad, stepped behind the White House press podium with a smirk and a shrug. "What we're seeing in Burkina Faso is just another fake revolution," he said. "A bunch of guys with guns and slogans trying to play president. Nothing new, nothing legitimate. Certainly not something the United States is going to recognize." It took only 10 minutes for the quote to explode across the internet, and 2 more for Trump to tweet it himself in all caps. "Another fake revolution in Africa. Total mess, not our problem. Stay strong, Africom." It was not a surprise, but it struck like a slap nonetheless. Ibrahim saw the footage while seated in the half-ruined parliament chamber, now serving as his temporary command post. The electricity sputtered, the fan turned slowly, and the laptop streaming the broadcast rested on a stack of books. Sankra's speeches, Fannin's essays, and a dog-eared copy of The Wretched of the Earth. His advisors, still few and mostly informal, looked to him. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he leaned into the microphone during a live national radio segment, voice calm but cutting with unmistakable clarity. "We are not fake. We are fed up." He let the sentence breathe. No further comment. No rage. Just truth distilled to defiance. The phrase took flight almost instantly. Within hours, the slogan was spray-painted across market walls in Bobo Dioulasso, printed on hand-sewn banners, in Kaya scrawled in chalk, across school desks in Kudugu. TikTok videos with the quote "in" captions flooded West African feeds. Young artists sampled it over traditional drum beats. A remix dropped on SoundCloud titled "Fed Up Nation." And yet the pushback from the West only grew. State Department officials began quietly pulling embassy staff from Ouagadougou. A flurry of diplomatic cables labeled Ibrahim as politically unpredictable. Human rights NGOs received sudden freezes on logistics permits. AFRICOM doubled the security around its base outside the capital for precaution. They said though Ibrahim had issued no threat. He held a press conference the following week. No suit, no flag behind him. Just a folding chair, a microphone, and a backdrop of local market workers and women carrying infants on their backs. He spoke only once about foreign criticism. "I will not ask permission to heal what others have broken. If democracy means the right to vote for your own humiliation, we need a better word." A hush followed. In Washington, analysts debated whether he was dangerous or merely naive. In Paris, think tanks scribbled policy notes under headlines like "containment strategy." But inside Burkina Faso, something else was happening. Trust. For the first time in decades, people were not afraid of their leader. He walked among them without guards, ate from street vendors, refused limousines. At night, he sat with mechanics teachers, young mothers listening more than he spoke. He told them, "This chair I sit in is not a throne. It's a placeholder." But he also knew the world wasn't going to let him hold it for long, especially not Trump, especially not the ones building bases on borrowed land. Change came not as a flood, but as controlled fire, deliberate, strategic, and surgical. Within the first 30 days of his transitional leadership, Ibrahim signed 3 executive directives that would redraw the lines of ownership and power in Burkina Faso, not just on paper, but in spirit. The first was the termination of all foreign mining contracts effective immediately. The decree was read aloud on national radio and posted outside courthouses and city halls, hand-painted in both French and local dialects. It named names: Canadian, Chinese, French, and American firms with years left on leases were ordered to halt operations. Machinery was impounded. Executive staff given 1 week to leave the country. No exceptions. When reporters asked what legal precedent justified the cancellations, Ibrahim simply replied, "Land stolen under silence cannot be protected by law." The move sent shockwaves through international markets. Stock values for several multinationals dipped. Threats of lawsuits rolled in. Trade envoys demanded closed-door meetings. But domestically, something incredible happened. Farmers returned to fields that had been fenced off for a decade. Wells once guarded by private security were reopened to villages. Then came the People's Land Trust. Funded initially through seized mining revenue and voluntary donations from diasporas abroad, the trust was created to buy back, protect, and redistribute land to rural families who had lost titles under development zoning. The program wasn't perfect. There were disputes, overlapping claims, logistical chaos, but it was real. And that alone was revolutionary. Families that had lived for generations as squatters on their own ancestral soil now held printed deeds in hand. Entire neighborhoods gathered to watch elders sign their names or make thumbprints on documents that returned dignity alongside land. For the first time in years, the national flag didn't feel like decoration. But not everyone welcomed the fire. The United States announced the withdrawal of its military advisors, citing irreconcilable policy differences. Their departure was swift but silent. No farewell, no press coverage, just emptied offices and cleared checkpoints. And yet the base remained. The massive facility outside Ouagadougou, officially known as Forward Operations Base Echo 7, remained lit, active, humming with flights and transmissions. No diplomatic handshake had given permission for its construction years ago, and none had rescinded it now. When asked during a town hall whether he planned to shut it down, Ibrahim paused. Not yet, he said. Not until we're ready. And when we are, it will be permanent. He wasn't naive. The flames he'd lit were already drawing flies, international pressure, whispered threats, subtle sabotage. But he knew something his enemies did not. You cannot unburn what has already caught fire. And the people, his people, were burning with belief. The meeting room inside the White House was pristine, polished to perfection. Gold trim lined the walls. Flags flanked a long oval table. Every chair had been measured, positioned, and documented on an itinerary that ran down to the second. Everything in the room radiated control except for the man sitting at the end of the table, with hands folded loosely over a red folder. President Donald Trump. He didn't rise when Ibrahim Traoré entered. He merely smiled. That smug, televised half-grin Americans had come to expect, and others across the world had come to loathe. You're taller than you look on screen, Trump said, motioning lazily toward the chair across from him. Ibrahim didn't smile back. He offered a polite nod, sat, and placed no papers, no pens, no aids on the table, just his bare hands and steady eyes. Around them sat the delegations, polished U.S. State Department officials, AFRICOM generals, economic advisors, and two men in tailored suits who hadn't been introduced but reeked of intelligence. On Ibrahim's side, there were just three people: a young female economic coordinator, a lawyer fluent in 4 languages, and a retired Burkina colonel who hadn't said a word since they landed. The room was silent for a moment longer than comfort allowed. Trump cleared his throat. Let's get to it. We need to talk about the base. You're making moves that threaten a lot of good people doing important work. Counterterrorism, supply chain, protection, regional security your region. Our presence keeps you safe whether you admit it or not. Ibrahim leaned forward slightly, folding his fingers together. He didn't respond. Not yet. Trump continued, voice growing more confident, like a man accustomed to breaking poker faces. Let's be honest here. You're in over your head. You're a young guy with some fire, sure, but fire burns fast. You need stability. You need allies. And we're giving you both, whether your slogans like it or not. One of the generals beside him nodded. The AFRICOM footprint in Burkina Faso is designed to assist. We share intelligence. We neutralize threats before they reach your borders. We offer joint exercises. Your own officers have benefited from our support. Still, Ibrahim said nothing. A staffer leaned in and whispered something in Trump's ear. He waved her off and leaned back in his chair, arms crossing over his chest. You've made waves, kid, Trump said. But don't mistake headlines for legacy. You're not Sankara. You're not Mandela. You're just the guy standing in front of the wrong train. The words hung heavy, a threat dressed as casual commentary. Ibrahim finally looked up, eyes sharp, calm, and focused like a blade just before it draws blood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't fidget. He simply stared across the table until even the photographers outside the door seemed to sense something had shifted. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and dry, the syllables falling like quiet stone on marble. Your presence doesn't keep us safe, he said. It keeps us obedient. A murmur stirred at the far end of the table. Trump leaned forward slightly, expression hardening. Excuse me, Ibrahim didn't blink. You say you offer stability, but what you mean is submission. You offer support with conditions. You send aid with contracts. You keep soldiers in our soil and call it protection. But we remember what protection used to look like. It came in different uniforms. It spoke French. Before that, it came with chains. He leaned back, slow and deliberate. Trump opened his mouth but paused as if unsure whether to laugh or lash out. Ibrahim's final words in the room came like a closing bell. I didn't come here to ask permission. I came here to listen to your terms so I know what I'm rejecting. Silence followed, long, stretching, uncomfortable. The meeting broke without handshakes. Outside, reporters gathered like vultures. No statements were issued. But inside the room, every person present, ally or enemy, understood something unspoken. This was not a negotiation. This was a warning. The second meeting was less formal, more hostile. It was held in a side wing of the West Wing, inside a private strategy room, typically reserved for war briefings and classified briefings with foreign heads of state. There was no press, no flags, no advisors at the table this time, just Donald Trump, 2 of his closest security officials, and Ibrahim Traoré, seated across from them with only one interpreter who barely spoke. Trump wasn't smiling anymore. He leaned in, elbows on the table, voice quiet but coiled with threat. "We've tried to be reasonable. We've given you space. But you're playing a dangerous game. Our military installations aren't symbolic. They're strategic. And your actions are beginning to suggest something closer to aggression than partnership." Ibrahim didn't respond. He'd heard this tone before years ago, when the mining corporations came with papers and bribes backed by uniforms. Trump continued tapping his ring against the lacquered tabletop with slow, deliberate beats. "Your reforms. Fine. Dramatic. Even romantic. But we both know that romance doesn't stop bullets. You want to nationalize land. That's your choice. But push us too far, and our response won't come in press statements. It'll come in forms you won't see until they're already circling your airspace." The room remained still. Then Trump straightened, exhaled through his nose, and raised his eyebrows in that practiced, theatrical way he did when delivering the final offer. So he said, "What's your decision?" No sound followed. The interpreter didn't speak. The air in the room seemed to contract. The weight of American power pressed into every corner, economic, military, diplomatic. The question was rhetorical. The answer was supposed to be compliance. But Ibrahim met Trump's eyes, slowly, unwavering, and then he said it. "Burkina Faso is not for sale. Not to you. Not to anyone." The silence that followed was unlike any silence the room had ever held. It was not the pause before negotiation. It was not hesitation. It was a final word, unmoved, clean, absolute. One of Trump's aides blinked hard, breaking eye contact. The security advisor shifted in his seat, jaw tight. Trump himself leaned back, expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and contempt, like he wasn't sure whether to laugh, threaten again, or walk out. He did none of the above. He stood slowly, pushed back his chair with a scraping sound, and walked to the door. "History remembers fools," he muttered almost to himself. "History remembers the brave," Ibrahim replied, still seated, voice level. The door closed behind them. That might have been the end of it, a tense exchange behind closed doors, buried in government memos, and forgotten by the next news cycle. But it wasn't, because someone in the room, no one ever confessed who had recorded it. Just 12 seconds of grainy audio followed by 7 seconds of still silence. Trump's question, Ibrahim's answer, the stillness that followed. By the next morning, the clip had leaked onto a secure military chat server. Within 12 hours, it had landed on an anonymous Twitter account. By the end of the day, it had gone global. Subtitled, remixed, overlaid on images of Burkina flags, waving under stormy skies on TikToks and protest montages, in WhatsApp groups from Nairobi to Oakland. A rapper in Lagos sampled the line in a track within 24 hours. Street artists in Tunis and Rio painted it on abandoned walls. "Burkina Faso is not for sale." The line became more than defiance. It became a mantra for sovereignty, for resistance, for all the small nations told to stay quiet while giants negotiated over their futures. Some media outlets called the moment a diplomatic disaster. Others called it political suicide. But to millions around the world, it was a line in the sand that wasn't just drawn, it was carved in stone. And as the video continued to circle the globe, people began to ask not who Traoré was, but what he had just begun. The response from Washington was swift and sharp. Within 72 hours of the leaked clip reaching global circulation, the U.S. Treasury Department announced sanctions on Burkina Faso's central banking system. All ongoing aid programs, development grants, and military training operations were suspended indefinitely. Frozen accounts, blocked payments. American-funded infrastructure projects came to a grinding halt. Officials called it a measured disciplinary response to unconstitutional behavior and destabilizing rhetoric. It was war not with bullets, but with numbers. The currency dropped. Food prices surged. Medical imports delayed at ports. NGOs scrambled for backup funds. The State Department issued a travel advisory level 4, do not travel. And still, the people did not turn on him. Instead, they turned toward him. In Ouagadougou, Bobo Dioulasso, and dozens of towns in between, thousands poured into the streets, not to riot, but to stand. They raised handmade signs quoting his words, painted walls with slogans of sovereignty, drummed for hours beneath a scorching sun as an act of unity. Some carried images of Sankara beside his, calling him the echo after the silence. Others took a darker route, burning American flags in city squares and stomping on shredded pieces of cardboard painted like drones. But Ibrahim didn't celebrate. He stepped onto a makeshift stage in front of the Parliament building, surrounded by dust microphones and hope. When he spoke, his voice cut through the crowd like steady rain through fire. "We will not become what we resist," he said. "This is not a war against a flag, not against a people. It is against domination, and domination wears many uniforms. We will not answer power with chaos. We will answer it with vision." He paused, eyes scanning the crowd. "No more burning, no more cursing. Build something instead. Build what they said we couldn't." And they listened. That night, as footage of the speech went viral, a tweet from a Ghanaian journalist went viral in parallel. It read simply, "He roared without raising his voice. The quiet lion." The phrase caught fire. Within days, the internet gave him a name no regime or media outlet could erase the quiet lion, a symbol of unshaken strength, calm fury, uncompromising dignity. Hashtag spread, hashtag quiet lion. Not for sale. Fed Up Nation. Young people in Nairobi and Harar began printing t-shirts. College students in Brazil organized a virtual teach-in on Traoréism. Protest groups in the U.S. quoted him in their speeches and then added their own twist: "If they own our future, we own the fight." Meanwhile, in the diplomatic halls of Geneva and New York, officials debated resolutions and quietly panicked. But for the people of Burkina Faso, the question was no longer whether Ibrahim Traoré could lead. It was how far he would go. It began with a cup of ginger tea, a routine gesture in the late afternoon poured by a longtime aide, a man who had once walked beside Ibrahim through underground tunnels when revolution had no face and hope was smuggled in whispers. A man who had carried leaflets, evaded drones, and risked his family for the cause. And yet, hours later, Ibrahim lay curled on the cold tile floor of his modest residence, vomiting bile, his body drenched in sweat, vision fractured into flashes of ceiling light and spinning walls. No one could explain the sudden collapse. The first doctor assumed dehydration, the second infection, but the third, a woman flown in quietly from Dakar at the insistence of one of Ibrahim's few trusted military allies, was blunt. "It was deliberate," she said, "and recent." The compound fell into silence. Security protocols tripled. The teacup was tested, the kitchen quarantined, the entire residence locked down. The aide who had poured it was nowhere to be found. He had disappeared that same night, leaving behind a burned SIM card and a neatly folded uniform. No note, no explanation, only betrayal. In the hours that followed, trust became a dangerous currency. His closest circle, once bonded by shared risk and vision, grew taut with silence and sideward glances. Every movement was watched, every word weighed. Fingerprints were tested, surveillance footage reviewed. But the culprit remained a ghost swallowed by the very revolution he had once served. Traoré, still recovering, issued no public statement. The people were told he was resting due to fatigue. The headlines speculated, was he ill, hiding dead? He didn't correct them, because something in him had shifted. That night, as he sat alone in a candlelit room, the electricity cut due to a rolling blackout, Ibrahim stared at the cup now sealed inside a plastic evidence bag and whispered only one word. Why? No answer came. But the lesson did. From that day forward, he began to vanish, not entirely, but slowly, deliberately. His public appearances grew rare, limited to pre-recorded speeches, tightly secured events, distant silhouettes behind armored glass. His once free-walking presence in markets and gatherings disappeared. In his place, messengers, advisors, radio messages, and encrypted voice clips signed only "The Quiet Lion Still Watches." He no longer slept in the same place twice. Each night, a new location, hidden rooms behind bakeries, repurposed wine cellars, mud brick huts behind mosques. Only 2 people ever knew where he was at a given time. Even his guards rotated blindly, never seeing him twice in a row. He became myth once more, not out of vanity, out of necessity. Because the truth was now clear, it wasn't just the West that feared his flame. It was those inside the fire, those who saw his integrity not as virtue but as threat. Those who had joined the revolution expecting spoils positions, contracts, and found instead a man unwilling to sell what he'd bled to protect. The poison had done more than scar his body. It had changed the way he breathed. The world still saw a lion, but now the lion hunted in shadows. The sanctions didn't come with bombs or boots. They came in silence, the kind that fills a pharmacy shelf once full, now lined with dust and paper notices. First it was medicines, insulin, antibiotics, surgical gloves. The deliveries stopped. Foreign suppliers cited compliance issues. Hospitals grew quiet. Lines outside clinics stretched longer. Then came the fuel shortages, the flickering electricity, the blackout maps spreading like bruises across radio reports. Markets struggled. Rice doubled in price. School lunches vanished. The old whispered of famine. The young scrolled news feeds in the dark, searching for someone to blame. And in time, some blamed him. The man who had stood defiant in front of the world now found his name muttered beneath sighs at dry water taps. Mothers cursed his name under their breath as they walked hours to find fever medicine. Traders grumbled that dignity could not fill stomachs. His slogans, once painted across every wall, now faded under sun and frustration. And still Ibrahim remained mostly unseen. Until one day, without announcement, he stood again on national television. No dramatic entrance, no banner. Just him, thinner, paler, with lines beneath his eyes and a voice heavier than before. He wore a plain shirt, no sash, no podium. He stood alone under a flickering light, speaking directly into a camera that broadcast his image into every barbershop, school, and home still lucky enough to have power. "My people," he began, voice quiet. "I see the pain, I feel it, and I will not pretend otherwise." He looked down for a moment, then slowly, deliberately, he bowed his head. "I am sorry." He let the words settle. There was no but, no deflection, just silence. When he raised his head again, the fire returned to his gaze, dimmed by fatigue but unbroken. "I did not choose the world we inherited, but I have chosen not to pass it on. What we suffer now is not punishment for pride. It is the cost of refusing to sell what was never theirs to buy." He continued slowly, clearly, each word carried not like a sword, but like a wound made holy. We could return to comfort. We could sign papers, reopen ports, smile for cameras, and let others redraw our borders in secret meetings. But that would not end our suffering. It would delay it. It would plant it deeper. The camera zoomed slightly closer. He didn't blink. "If you wish for a new leader, I will step aside. If the people vote to return to the old ways, I will respect it. But while I serve, I will not trade justice for convenience." He stepped back. No anthem, no applause. Just the click of the feed cutting to static. Outside in the courtyard of a hospital with empty shelves, a nurse wiped tears from her cheek and whispered, "He's still here." In the northern town of Dori, where water trucks now arrived only twice a week, a merchant murmured, "He's not lying." And in the capital, where protest banners had been replaced by silence, a teenage boy rewrote a quote on a wall with chalk, "Even lions limp." The letter arrived folded inside a worn cloth pouch, hand-delivered by a village midwife who'd once bandaged Ibrahim's knee when he was 7. She didn't speak as she handed it to his security detail. She didn't need to. The stitching on the fabric was enough. His mother's hands. That night, alone in a candlelit room hidden beneath an abandoned schoolhouse, Ibrahim unfolded the parchment slowly. The edges were frayed. The ink faded in places, as if the pen had paused too long or the hand had trembled too much. The first line was in her unmistakable script. "You don't need to win. You need to be real." He read the line twice, then a third time. The letter wasn't long. It didn't mention politics. It didn't speak of sacrifice or strategy or what the neighbors were saying. It simply told him stories, reminders from a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. Of the smell of mangoes rotting too fast in the summer heat. Of the quiet clink of ceramic bowls as they ate rice by the light of an oil lamp. Mouths quiet because food was scarce and every grain mattered. Of his father's laugh when he wasn't worrying about land titles or debt. Of the night he'd slept beside her during a thunderstorm whispering, "If I had power, I'd make the clouds quiet." And finally a line that made his throat close. "If your hands are clean, your heart will never be alone." For a long time he just sat there. The room was silent except for the soft crackle of the candle burning low, its flame shrinking, swaying, almost hesitant. He thought of everything he had built, everything he had lost, the weight of his choices, the blood he'd prevented, and the suffering he'd been unable to stop. He thought of the poison, of the silence in the streets, of the way people looked at him now, not with awe, but with expectations so heavy they crushed even his breath. And slowly, without warning, he began to cry. Not the restrained tears of a man trained to hide pain, but full open sobs, the kind he hadn't allowed himself since his father's funeral, when he stood beside a wooden box and promised to change a country he didn't yet understand. The letter trembled in his hand. He let it. There in that room with no cameras, no speeches, no slogans, only a candle and the ink of a mother's truth, Ibrahim Traoré wept. Not because he was broken, but because he was still real. On a quiet morning in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim signed the most consequential decree of his presidency. All foreign military bases in Burkina Faso must shut down within 90 days. The message was clear, the language simple. No appeals, no exceptions. The news sent shockwaves through Western capitals. Diplomats scrambled. Think tanks speculated. Headlines screamed unstable. But across Africa, a different echo began to rise. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and Guinea issued public statements of review and reconsideration regarding foreign military contracts. In private, several quietly requested copies of the legal structure Traoré had used. The world was panicking, but the continent was awakening. And through it all, Ibrahim said little. He didn't boast. He didn't provoke. He simply told his people, freedom isn't proven when the chains are cut. It's proven when we choose never to wear them again. Over the next few months, a new political idea began to take shape. Not a party, not a government, but a movement. Online, they called it Traoréism, a blend of uncompromising sovereignty, local dignity, and anti-imperial clarity. Youth movements in Ghana, Gambia, and South Africa picked up the slogan, "Not for sale," as their own. University students in Dakar published essays on the Quiet Lion Doctrine. TikTok and YouTube overflowed with translated speeches, remix edits, and animated explainers. But as the flame grew brighter, Ibrahim began stepping back. When asked about running for a full presidential term, he shook his head. Revolutions fail when their leaders stay too long. I did my part. Now I return the power to the people. Against every prediction, he refused re-election. A peaceful, independent electoral process was announced. When reporters begged for comment, he simply replied, "I am not the future. I was only the door." Years later, a young American journalist traveled through dusty roads and quiet farmlands to find the man the world once watched with awe. He found him in a small village near the Ghanaian border, teaching philosophy to teenagers under a mango tree. No guards, no medals, just a notebook, a chalkboard, and the soft laughter of students. The interview was short. "Do you miss power?" the journalist asked. Traoré smiled. "Power is a mirror. Most men get lost in their reflection. I prefer windows. I prefer, and how would you like history to remember you?" He paused, looked toward the setting sun. A soldier wins, a president serves, but a man just walks away. That evening, the final image burned into the lens was of Ibrahim walking down a dirt path. No entourage, wearing a faded cotton shirt, the sun spilling gold over his shoulders. And just like that, he was gone. But the echo remained. In a world where power often speaks the loudest, Ibrahim Traoré reminds us that quiet courage can echo louder than commands. His calm defiance wasn't rooted in pride, it was grounded in dignity. When he faced one of the most powerful figures on earth and chose not to shout, but to speak 6 honest words, he didn't just resist. He reclaimed something far deeper, the right to be heard without fear. This isn't just a political story, it's a human one, about integrity under pressure, about refusing to be reduced to a pawn on someone else's chessboard. And in that moment, he didn't just speak for Burkina Faso, he spoke for anyone who's ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated. Now I wonder, have you ever had to stand your ground, not with anger, but with truth? What did it cost you, and was it worth it? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.